Hello and welcome to the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with a loved one in a group of high demand, high control. I am your host, Jennifer. A lot has changed since I first started this podcast, so I thought I'd add a little to the initial introductions and provide something that's more up to date. I work with survivors of coercive control one-to-one. I also consult with families, and I offer education to the public around such topics. For the full scope of what I offer and also my credentials, you're welcome to check out my website, jennifer-french.com. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and as of August 2024, I've been accepted into a PhD program called Psychology, Policy, and Law, and I'll have a specialty in either criminal behavior or forensic victimology. This will support the work that I currently do as an expert witness in cases involving coercive control. The Project Hope podcast has provided such an amazing opportunity for me to meet many wonderful people, survivors, experts, family members, and it's truly a pleasure to meet each one of these individuals you will hear from. This podcast will conclude with Season 2 as I enter into my PhD program, but I have many other exciting things on the horizon, so please stay in touch and go to my website for any and all current events. Thanks to all of you who listen to Project Hope and care about this community. In 1989, at age 22, Alexandra Amor moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, and joined what she thought was a meditation class. 10 years later, she escaped what she describes as having become a mind control cult run by a self-serving guru. Leaving behind all her friends, her spiritual community, her sense of self, and the man she loved, Alexandra moved out into the world searching for healing and to understand what had happened to her. Cult, A Love Story, is the Amazon best-selling, award-winning memoir that shows by example how we are drawn into high-demand cultic groups and what recovery from that experience looks like. For me, this is one of those books that is helpful from every angle, as Alexandra so beautifully writes about her experience and then gives us the bonus of seamlessly weaving it into her own learning about these patterns typically found in cultic groups and controlling leaders. I highly recommend this book for families and friends with a loved one in such a situation, as well as those who have left such groups and want a really well-written memoir that also serves to educate. Alexandra states of her book, Cult, A Love Story explores my personal journey of descent into the hell that is a mind control cult. And it is also a story of self-discovery and of the opportunities for healing that are available to us when we leave a cult. This book was not written as a vitriolic screed against my cult leader, because in my opinion, that kind of memoir serves no one, but rather as a step-by-step guide from personal experience about how and why one gets drawn into a cult and what it is that keeps us trapped once we're there. My intention was to use my experience and research about what had happened to me to educate others and to bring more understanding to everyone about how cults work. I tie my experience into Robert Lifton's 8 criteria of thought reform to model and explain in real-life terms how cults work and why those who are in a cult or high-demand group are unable to see what is happening to them. The book also chronicles the beginnings of my journey of cult recovery as a guide for those who are on their own journey and for those family members and friends who want to understand what their loved one is going through. Cult, A Love Story has been read by cult survivors and their families all over the world, from remote British Columbia, Canada, to Australia, Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. The year this book was published, it won a bronze medal in the category of autobiography/memoir at the IPPY Awards. And she continues to state, I'm proud of all my books, but I know that this is the one that has changed the most lives, and for that I am extremely grateful. Alexandra currently lives in Vancouver and is a well-established novelist. She's written 4 animal adventures for middle grade readers, set on a fictional island in the Salish Sea, several historical mysteries set in 1890 in frontier British Columbia, and a cozy romantic mystery. I actually just purchased a few of her books as holiday gifts. It's December of 2020 as we are recording this, and I expect I'll be stealing them back from my relatives to check them out myself. But really, Alexandra Amor describes the novel she writes as being about love, friendship, and the search for truth. That sounds like my kind of writing. Also, for those of you who are already converted mystery fans, be sure to check out her show called It's a Mystery Podcast. All links can be found in the podcast notes, but in the meantime, Alexandra's website is alexandraamor.com. So, Alexandra, I want to welcome you to the Project Hope podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm so excited to talk to you and really happy to be here and honored. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So, as our audience already knows, we'll be speaking quite a lot about your story, but of course, you've written a book about it called Cult, a Love Story, 10 Years Inside a Canadian Cult and the Subsequent Long Road of Recovery. The Long Road of Recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so, Alexandra, maybe you could just give us kind of a high-level understanding. I mean, I think one of the things that is so interesting about your story is that it has so many of these similarities that all of these organizations have. And yet, as you explain, it was a fairly small group, which I very much relate to as well, because the organization that I was a part of was relatively small in the same sense. I mean, we did span out into other cities, but as you're describing your meditations that were like 20 people to 15 to 10, that's very familiar to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It was tiny. And I'll say right off the top, I'm probably going to refer to Vancouver in our interview. And the group wasn't Nexium. And I'll say that right now because we're recording this in 2020 and Nexium has been all over the news. And so whenever anybody hears my story, they assume it's that one, but it wasn't. It was just a small, very small group. It was actually started as a class to learn how to meditate. And it was run by a charismatic woman who sort of considered herself to be a spiritual medium. And there was a lot of channeling in the group. And she was, I think, as much as we were on a journey, she was as well. Looking back in hindsight, she was on a journey learning how to coerce and manipulate people. So that's kind of an interesting part of it as well. So
right, it's like you were there for her evolution as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So much like yourself, I was in my early 20s. I was in a city that I was brand new to. I didn't know anybody except I had family there, my mother, stepfather, and brother, but I didn't have any friends. And when I arrived, it was immediately after university and I was looking for a job. So very much in that, in a transitional point in life, which is always such a vulnerable time for people, especially when we're young, but for anyone. And I wouldn't say that I was searching spiritually, but I think I was searching psychologically because I had kind of a difficult upbringing and I was trying to find answers, I guess is the best way to put it. And so this group seemed to offer all the answers. The leader really gave that impression that, her way of teaching had the answer to everything. So I was really attracted to that.
Yes. Yes. So, just to take a step back, one of the things that I was really looking forward to discussing with you, and then as I had my initial thought about this, you then very much address it toward the end of the book, where I noticed that the title of your book has the word cult in it. And I found it interesting. I think one of the things that I thought was so beautiful about your book that some of the memoirs just don't include is your healing process and your kind of inner thoughts about what was going on for you as you left, as you started kind of that healing journey or process. And one of my immediate thoughts was kind of this word cult, and I wondered if you could share a little bit about that transition for you, because I thought it's something that a lot of people can relate to, that to kind of come to terms with even using that word.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So in the book, I talk about how there was a traumatic event that happened where I was dating someone in the group, and then the guru had him break up with me in front of several other people when we were at the fishing lodge that she owned in central British Columbia. And so that event was really traumatizing for me for a number of reasons. One, because of the loss of the relationship. Two, because of the humiliation involved. And then three, I think because of the shunning that goes on in any kind of coercive group, where when you do something that's outside the bounds of the rules that they've set, you're shunned, essentially. People stop talking to you, stop looking at the people wouldn't look at me anymore when I went to the meditation circles. Anyway, so I was really very traumatized and had never experienced that kind of trauma and grief. And so very wisely, my mother suggested I go and see a therapist. So I did.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, though, that, and even for about, well, I'll get into that in a minute, but I wasn't there because the group was a cult. I was there in therapy because I was grieving and traumatized.
Yes.
And the therapist was incredible. And she gave me a copy of the Guru Papers after a few months. I think she had figured out what was going on.
Yeah.
And I still have my copy. You probably may not be able to see it, but it's up there on my bookshelf. And so I read her copy, and I was just floored about all the similarities about what they were describing. And I made this whole list of notes. And then I took her book back to her the following week, and I shared the notes with her, and we talked about them. And I think she even asked to keep them. And I still hadn't connected the dots that our group was a cult. I just thought these things that the book is addressing were similar to things that I had experienced. And I just think that's so extraordinary that we're, our thought processes have been so changed by being in a coercive group that we can be basically hit in the face with evidence and we still can't see it, which is such a powerful testament to what mind control does to a person. And so it was not until probably 2 years later, I would think I was in my third year of recovery, when the penny actually dropped, and I went, oh, this is a cult. And I had been reading lots of other books. After the Guru Papers, I read a whole bunch of other ones. But it took that long for me to kind of untangle those knots in my head and come to that conclusion.
Yes. It's amazing. And I also really appreciate how much you shared about your healing journey, because it's so different for different people.
Yeah.
And that's so and so I think especially after having left something that's so controlling, it's so vital for us to be able to unfold in the newness at the pace that's right for us, for our systems, for our inner world, for our spiritual world and life.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, it's not really something, it's like a flower blooming. Nobody else can force it to happen. It has to happen at its own pace. And as you say, for every person, that will be different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I loved also how you, I'm going to deviate for a moment to kind of go into part of what I loved about your book is that you kind of go back and forth from telling the story to using resources that are educational about the experience that you were having at that moment, or using quotes or concepts about around this field. And I so appreciated that about your book because, like, I have to say, obviously I interview other people who are writers and come with their memoirs, and the memoirs are so often really incredible. I have to say that at this point, your memoir is sort of now the top one that I would recommend for people getting out, because you're doing that beautiful dance between your story and really some education around all of this. And that was so powerful for me. Um, just actually seeing how these concepts play out in a really personal example. And so I thought also that story just around meeting Mary, your therapist, and and working with her, and how you share that that for you that this process was sort of many years, and it was important for it to be gentle.
Mm,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
and also kind of the awakening that is allowed in that gentility to really become re-empowered, depending on how we were before or how we've experienced our own empowerment, but to really gain that back, to gain that empowerment back by being in our own healing process. So I thought it
Yeah.
was really beautiful how you said, there are people out there who really do know about this field, and it's great to find kind of a cult expert therapist and also get the help you need.
Yeah.
And therapists are great too. I mean, it's really nice to have an example of somebody who you just went to thinking, I just need help, and that she's so beautifully worked with you in that way.
Yeah, it was so great. I mean, I think I really lucked out because I know hearing from other people, it can sometimes take some time to find a therapist who's a good fit for you.
Yeah.
And she was a really good fit for me. And she obviously had some awareness about coercive environments because, I mean, she had a copy of the Guru papers and saw what was happening. So that was great.
Yes.
Yeah. And thank you for saying that about my book. I really appreciate it. That's very kind. And you know, I wrote the book that I wanted to read. So I mentioned that for those 3 years, I was reading a lot about the phenomenon of coercive control, and the books were so great. And so many of them, though, were psychological or sociological in nature, which is fantastic, but they read more like a textbook.
Yes.
And then the opposite end of that spectrum was people's personal stories, which and at the time, of course, keep in mind when I was doing this was 20 years ago. It was in 2000.
Yeah.
So there wasn't as much available then as there is now. There's a ton of books available, which is fantastic. So I wanted to read a story about how someone had had a cult experience and have them explain to me what was going on, and do exactly what I tried to do in the book, which was weave in the explanation from a psychological or sociological point of view and show it happening in real time, and with real life examples. And so that's why I structured it that way.
Yes. Yeah. And so just quickly looping back to the title of the book and the usage of the word cult.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously that was something that you kind of graduated into as you expressed in your healing, as you were coming to terms with this and then sort of embracing that term, which I know can just be so uncomfortable for people. And it's a loaded term. I mean, it,
Mm-hmm.
has associations mostly for people with major cults that ended in deaths. So
Yeah.
that's very scary. Not that other experiences in cults are not, but so I also really loved that in the book you address using a love story.
Mm.
And, just before you shared that in the book, I started to feel that.
Oh, wow.
It was really neat, like in your story. So, for the listeners, a huge part of this story that's sort of woven throughout this is your relationship with this gentleman, Michael. And I found it also really interesting to have the experience of really feeling the friendship and the core bond between the two of you, and the two of you also spending many years in a emotional and spiritual connection, but not a relational sexual relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course that changed in a dictated type of way, but I'm partly welcomed as well,
Yeah.
because it seems like the two of you, just had a simpatico depth of connection that really, well, I mean, I would just say, I hope it's okay for me to be putting these words in your mouth, but that really, when I read about that relationship, I mean, it true, and you do sort of say this, that it truly felt to me like the quality of those love relationships that come along every once in a while in our lives. I mean, really a depth and a connection that is so, that hits you in a way that just doesn't happen all that often.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I was reading through your book, I found it so interesting at the end. I think maybe you even labeled it like love, sort of a love few paragraphs, and that it's a love story about you in this cult, a love story for the guru, but then a love story with Michael.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has to become a love story with yourself.
Right. Yep.
And I found that really beautiful. And I think the other thing that I just wanted to say as I was digesting kind of the power of that relationship and what transpired with it. Well, would you like to share a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I can. And I would add too that love encompasses the other people in the group.
Yes,
Right?
very
That's the other
much.
thing. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, and those women that, as you acknowledge, it's like you were young when you got in and then ended up having these very deep female relationships, which I think, again, as far as women go, I mean, there's really something so special about true sisterhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, this is just one of the biggest tragedies about cults is that the relationships are real. Even if the leader is manipulating the people within them, the the relationships are real that you have with the people that are in the same group, and so when we which is one of the things actually that keeps people tied to a group like this, right?
Yes.
And especially for someone, I mean, you were living in a sort of in a residential situation,
Yep.
so your job and your marriage and your spiritual pursuits were all tied up in that group. And for me, I was very fortunate that my job was outside the group, and we didn't live, as a group. Everybody lived in their own apartment or house or whatever in Vancouver, except for the people who lived in the fishing lodge up north. But so what happens is that when you leave, you lose all of that all at once. I mean, I can't think of another circumstance in life where that would occur.
Yes.
to a person. And as I said, that's one of the things that keeps us tied to them in a way.
Yeah.
Because, you look at it and go, geez, and for people in groups like, where their job is involved as well, they could also be leaving without any money because they've been serving for pennies, for
Yes.
decades. And say you're a 65-year-old man, how do you leave without any retirement savings, no money at all, no friends, and maybe you leave your spouse behind? I mean, it's just so terrible and
Yeah.
toxic. But your question was about Michael and the relationship. Yeah. So there was an instant connection between us, and I was fairly young when I joined, 21 or 22, and he was 16 years older, and we became really close friends. And then later, the cult leader sort of orchestrated a relationship between us, but as you said, it wasn't unwelcome to us. The tragic part of it was that he was married at the time.
Right.
So that just, created just such terrible trauma for his wife, of course.
Yeah.
And then for the two of us, I would say as well. But what a truly masterful stroke by the cult leader, because when people are put off balance in a situation like that, like Michael's wife was fully aware of what was going on, and she was even blamed for what was happening, that she wasn't being generous enough with him or a good enough wife or whatever. So he needed to have companionship elsewhere. And so there you have three people who are just in pain all the time. No matter what Michael did, he was causing pain to either his wife or me. His wife was just being tortured, and it wasn't a ton of fun for me either. And so I think in hindsight, it's just so much easier to control people when they're off balance like that.
Yes.
And then the thing that I really touch on, which was so revelatory to me when I finally came to understand it, was that the cult leaders have to have a vertical relationship between themselves and each individual person who's in the cult.
Yeah.
And the way that they strengthen that vertical relationship is by undermining the horizontal relationships that are in the group. So the cult leader essentially couldn't have Michael's loyalty be divided between myself and her. She needed him to choose. And the way that she got him to choose was to tell him that he either needed to choose God or me, Alexandra. And of course he made the choice, to choose God. And in that way, it was a bounded choice, as there's that famous book about coercive relationships. And that's a perfect example that he really, she just squished him between a brick and a hard place and made him choose. And so then, his loyalty became even more cemented to her. But that was the crack in me that started to then open up, and I started to wonder, what's really going on here, and as I mentioned, the rest of the group shunned me, and I started to think, well, wait a second, if, we talk about love and light all the time and God and all that good stuff, and yet we act so cruelly in these situations to one another, it just had stopped making sense. And so that's when I started to explore, I started to go to therapy and explore what was actually happening.
May I interject for a quick
Yes.
second?
Yeah.
So I loved this part of your process where you got so specific about it, where I think it was because I think that each of us leaving these organizations kind of has this moment, and maybe we retain it or maybe we don't, or maybe it's many little ones of this. But that moment where it's kind of like you have to present yourself with some question. And if you get the answer to it, the cult is wrong.
Mm.
And I loved how for you, and correct me if I'm wrong about the terms, but you had to deduce that you liked love and compassion, and that those were not happening there. And that was kind of the thing that you could hold on to make the choice, that you needed, your soul and your being needed to be in alignment with that. And you could no longer exist there because that was not happening with the guru.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I remember, and I talk about it in the book, I remember even saying to myself, if God represents something other than compassion and kindness and love, then I'm willing to exist without God, because those values mean more to me, and God in quotes, whatever that means. And of course, well, maybe it's not of course for everybody, but that isn't true. But yeah, like you say, that was a moment for me where I asked myself a question and then found a true answer for myself. And that was what enabled me to start the process of leaving. Yeah.
I am delighted to offer you Pure Haven products. All proceeds received go right back to the Project Hope podcast. I myself have been using these pure, safe, and toxin-free products for over 4 years, and I absolutely love knowing that my home has countertops that my little niece and nephew can eat off of without worrying that they have a handful of chemicals being placed in their mouths. The cleaning products are some of my favorites. The glass and surface cleaners smell amazing as well. So if this is of interest to you, please go to purehaven.com/Jennifer French. The link is also included below with information about this podcast segment. Yeah, and then I don't know if you wanted to share anything more about Michael.
Yeah, it is an interesting sort of story, because he stayed with the group. He's still with the group. The cult leader died in 2013, I think. And yet he's still with sort of the last 2 or 3 people that really believe in her and still believe in everything that she teaches. And then in 2019, he wrote his own book about her, about our cult leader. And that was, it was a really interesting experience reading his book. And as I mentioned to you before when we chatted, I felt like he wrote about 20% of the experience, and he left out the other 80% of the experience. So he kind of wrote about the cult leader's more positive qualities, that she was charismatic, which is absolutely true. That she was very intuitive about people and could see things about people very quickly, which I think is, it's kind of a characteristic of a psychopath in a way. But anyway, but he left out all of the experience about the manipulation and control and psychological and spiritual abuse. It's like in his book, it doesn't even exist. The only thing he sort of says is that she could be difficult at sometimes. That's the word he uses, difficult. And I thought, well, yeah. So yeah, that was kind of a funny, a really interesting end to that story, I thought was, and in my book, in more recent editions, I have a little section called Dueling Memoirs, and I talk about his book.
Yeah. And I think, so at one point when you are talking about your connection with him and the pain of leaving this organization, not seeing him for, I believe, 5 years, the reconnection where it's like right back to where you left off, and then him kind of dropping the bomb at the end of this bizarre experience of him expressing that he has not gone a day without thinking of you, as you reciprocated, and then his realization that there's no way that the two of you can reunite, because obviously in his mind you are settled in your life without God and without service to God, and he couldn't be in alignment with that.
Right. Yes.
So it actually, I really, so that was one of the areas of your book where I legit cried, Alexandra.
Yeah.
Yeah, just feeling the love there. And I had a realization around the pain of that in some ways you have had this very layered experience of, because obviously with our audience being somewhat focused around family and friends that have a loved one in a cult, and you having had the experience that your mom actually brought you to your first meditation class with this guru, and then your mother did end up leaving a few years later. But there's the family connection there, and your mother being out of the group then, and the distance there. And then it occurred to me with Michael that there's this layer where you're leaving behind, and in leaving the group, you're now leaving behind this love of your life. And now you're on the outside hoping that he would get out, or that there would be some way so our audience is all too familiar with that pain and sorrow. I mean, to have a family member, a child, a spouse join an organization, and the distance and the loss and the lack of communication, or complete no communication, or like you're just talking to a different person. That it really, when I was thinking about you and your story and just feeling kind of all these layers of the heartbreak there. And it's sort of like in leaving, it's not like you left and then had other people that left with you and that you could connect with and be again in community, or that you left with the love of your life. It's like you're still mourning this beautiful relationship that could have been.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And that, I have to say, that pain of leaving somebody behind and not being able to get through to them is one of the worst things I've ever experienced. And I think it's one of the reasons that coercive environments are so cruel and toxic to family members, is because they create a prison without bars in the person who's in the group. And that person who's in the group demonizes, as you know from personal experiences, demonizes the people on the outside that actually love them and are trying to help them. That help looks like interference and what else? Coercion and, disrespect, all those sorts of things. Yeah.
Right. Disrespect, control, power over, which is in fact exactly what the leader of the organization is doing to you, not the people outside who are trying to help.
Yes. Yeah. So I haven't ever been able to find the words it's just the apex of manipulation, to turn somebody's mind so that they see love as hate and hate or coercion as love. It's just, terrible. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad we're talking about that, Alexandra, because again, it's one of these principles that, just like what you said, it's like, there should be a term for it.
Yes. Yes.
And, I've just said it so many times to, I kind of have a crew of parents who have loved ones in an organization. It's mostly a parental group. And it is just absolutely heartbreaking, when they call me when they're kind of ready to make a move or do something, reach out to their adult child, because the truth is, I always say, whatever your choice is that you do, you're the one that's going to have to live with that. Mm-hmm. So take what I say kind of with a grain of salt. Mm-hmm. And it is just this absolute bind. I always say it's like hands tied is all I can kids sort of say, it's like there is just no way to win, because anytime you reach out, even in the most sincere love, it will not be received that way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I've also shared, I think, in my story, one of the things that I definitely was aware of, it was sort of like a few layers under, but it was in my consciousness that I knew. And it happened mostly when I was starting to get a lot of letters from my parents, and I could read them quietly and kind of digest the words and be alone without the leaders around or anybody there, where there really was a part of me that I would hear the pain in their words, and a part of me got it. I knew that they were in pain and they loved me and they were desperate.
Mm-hmm.
And I also knew that I had started to be and speak differently with them. And I knew that that was confusing to them. And so when I received those words, while I would then, of course, share with my leaders, and they would say to me, oh, your father's so controlling. Oh, this and that. And, power over you. And you need to break free from that and be your own person. And there really was a part of me that knew that that was not what it was about for them. It wasn't that my dad was just trying to have some power over me or control what I was doing, or that they didn't like religion or something. I really did on some level know that they could not wrap their heads around what the heck was going on for me. And so that was also true, so again, it's so hard to advise people on what to do, because you just don't know what's going to hit the person who's in the cult in their heart or in their mind, in a way that, or they're in a particular moment where they're going through a really hard time and kind of subtly questioning, and it's just the right time.
Yeah.
So complex.
It is. And I love I think it's in Combating Cult Mind Control, Steve Hassan's book. He points out that the flame of the person's essential self never, ever goes out.
Yes.
It's always there. So the cult self does develop in layers on top of that, but it doesn't completely extinguish that authentic self. And that always gives me hope.
Yes. And I love that you brought that up, because it was actually something that I did want to talk to you about, because I loved that you wove this example of yourself as kind of cult persona, me persona. And I also think it's really difficult when you go in at a young age. I do think that there's something different about that. You may be familiar with this, but I just recently watched Seduced, which is India Oxenberg's story about leaving Nexium. And one of the things that comes up in that is that she talks about or acknowledges that even though she wasn't in there kind of the longest out of everyone, because she was young when she was in, it was kind of like it took a hold of her in a way that maybe it would take others longer.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, if you're 35 and you've had a variety of life experiences, it might not have that kind of a hold that it does on younger people, perhaps. That's very true. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you talked about the flame as well, because at times I have bristled against this idea of losing oneself completely. And so it was very helpful to hear your story and sort of see where these layers were coming in of the cult personality versus and also through your conversations with Michael. I found that really interesting, where when you were out, you acknowledged you could literally...
I could see it happening, him going back and forth.
Yeah. And it really did make me think about my family and how I am sure that they had that experience, because it was so odd for them for me to speak in such a dictatorial way. I am no longer going to see you now. I will not commit to this, or what have you. It was like, who are you?
I'm sure they could hear the cult or the coercion in the words you were saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's interesting because when I speak to other people who have loved ones in a cult, they definitely express that.
Mm. Yeah.
It's just so, they go, oh, well, obviously the guru reviewed that before they responded.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Either that, or we all just know the guru language so much, you don't even have to check with the guru anymore. You just verbalize what you know the guru would tell you.
Right. Another good, yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really love that concept, because I think it's a helpful way to process some of the things that maybe we do in the cultic environment that once we're out, we're horrified by.
Yeah.
And just some of these moments where it's like you take on the speak of the group and are calling people out, which is something you would just never do in normal society.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, and coming back to my book, I think that was one of the reasons that I wanted to be as honest as I possibly could about this love triangle that transpired between Michael and myself and his wife, because that is something I would never, ever do, when I'm in my right mind, as it were. And yet I thought it was such a good example to show the lengths that people will go to when we're coerced and when we think we're serving God, which is what our cult leader told us, was always the most important thing, as so many cults do. There's the big cause, and everything you do is kind of, it either serves that or it doesn't. And that's, again, how you're manipulated. And, I've spoken to people since being in the group, and I think it is an assumption people often make, that, oh, I would never do that. Nobody could ever get me to do that kind of thing. Or as you say, when we look back at ourselves, we can feel a lot of shame about the things that we did at the time. And I guess I just really wanted to show that, again, it's, terrible things can happen when you're from the best intentions, in a way, right? So our intention was to serve God, and terrible things happened. Yeah.
Yes. And I think this is why spiritual abuse in particular, to me, is just kind of the ultimate devastation and wreckage, because you are using somebody's relationship with the divine, really, which is also kind of ourselves, and messing with that.
Yeah.
In a way that is manipulative in terms kind of to your core and your essence. So
yeah, again, I mean, there's no words to express how twisted and horrible that is. Yeah, to use someone's essence against themselves, which is what's happening.
Yes. And I think also, I like how you said using somebody's essence, and it's that same principle where I love how you continually kind of refer back to the people in the group. And because as we go along in the story, you kind of get caught up in the story and going, oh, whoa, this is intense, what the work that they're doing with each other and how they're speaking to each other. And these people are kind of being put in a vice. But at the same time, there is a real love and a care and a mission that one really believes that they are serving the highest.
Yeah.
And that is very powerful. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like you said about Michael, it's like how, when you love God, how do you say, I'm going to choose a person over God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an impossible choice.
It is.
Yeah, especially for someone like him who he had felt for decades that there was sort of this purpose for his life and something that he was searching for. And of course, the cult leader used that against him and made that thing about her.
Yeah.
And so when it came to it, he just had no choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know why, so I'll just bring it up. But I had this memory of this part of the book that I just love. Maybe it's that I need some comic relief for a second. But the amazing scene where you all go out to Hawaii and the guru leads you through the rocks into the cave, into this sanctuary where you're now going to have this experience of some sort. And she asks you all, I forget what the words are, in so many words, to basically prostrate yourselves before her.
Yeah.
And there's one woman there who hadn't been around, and this was kind of her first exposure, and she's standing there like, oh, hell no.
Yes. Yes. And good for her. Yes. Yeah. We were in a cave in Hawaii, on Kauai. And she wanted us all to kneel and then bow forward with our arms outstretched. And I mean, I don't know who she was, this woman. I don't remember who she was, but I'd love to talk to her now and just ask her what she thought of that. Because she must have been looking around her going, who are these crazy people?
Well, and isn't it amazing that those experiences can happen? And again, every single person who's bought into the group just thinks that that person is unevolved or of the darkness in some way, or not on the same frequency, or
Yep,
just
absolutely. And there was someone in the group who was her close friend, and that was the reason this woman had come it was a retreat in Hawaii. And so that woman who was in our group broke up with this friend of hers, essentially, never spoke to her again because of what happened in the cave.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at some point that relationship has to divide anyway, because if you're in and your friends aren't in, then
Mm-hmm.
you're not aligned with them.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to take a quick look at my notes to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Oh, there was a quote that I loved, where you acknowledge that there's nothing more dangerous than a little bit of truth. And I really wanted to just bring that up because I think it's kind of like, for an educational element, it really feeds into that explanation of people kind of not understanding why people get in or why they buy into it. And that element where there's always some truth to it so that you can get hooked.
Yeah.
And I thought that was brilliant.
And, and I was reminded of that when I was listening to, I think it was one of the first two podcast episodes that you did about your journey, and I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but it's so true that, yeah, there is nothing as dangerous as a little bit of the truth. Because when I say that in the book, it's things like meditation is good for you, which it is, spirituality can be a beautiful thing, which it can. And when these things are woven into coercive control, they give it more power and make it more confusing in a way, because you can feel the truth of some of what's going on, and it does create a dissonance, I think, but in some way it helps you to kind of dismiss that dissonance.
Yes.
because you can feel the truth of some of what's being said. Yeah.
Right. And it's like, if you can see enough truth around, then I mean, your other conclusion is that they're lying.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just so hard to imagine.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Oh, Alexandra, it's really, your story has been just really, it's an incredible piece of work, I think, for people, this book.
Thank you.
One last question, actually, now that I think of it.
Yes.
So also, I wondered if you would just share a little bit about if you can speak to this, kind of what your mother shared with you in retrospect. I know that you do share about this in the book, but kind of what her process was as she was, basically brought you to the first meditation class, then left. Was it about a year or so later? Is kind of my perception.
Yeah, maybe 2. Yeah.
So she really knew and understood what you were in and the teachings and everything, and had bought into it herself for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, what a gift that you had her when you left and were just reeling. And of course, her beautiful suggestion for you to seek out a therapist. And obviously, then the healing journey continues.
Right.
But has she shared with you at all about, did she have thoughts about kind of getting you out or anything?
Yeah. She, afterwards, she talked about how she really felt trapped because she knew that my whole social circle and world was built around the group.
Yeah.
And so she was in a position where she knew that if I left, it would be really painful. She could probably see a lot of the manipulation that was going on. And at the same time, unlike your situation, our cult leader well, that's not true. I was going to say didn't cut us off from our families. For some people she did, but for me, for example, she didn't. Yeah. So I was still, I spent Christmas, we lived in the same city and I spent time with them all the time, and Christmas with them and holidays and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in a way, that connection with my family was never cut, which was really nice.
Now, may I ask, do you think that part of that was because the leader had known your mother, or was that just okay within the group, or were there subtle messages, like if you're hanging out with family too much, then you're hanging out with people who are less evolved? So there's a subtle message of something might be wrong with you if you're spending too much time with family.
Absolutely. Yeah. There were always those messages, and she, not just for me, but for everybody. And she would, yeah, it's so funny you say that. Yeah. She would say exactly those sorts of things. Like, let's say, for example, we were at one of the meetings and someone was having a conversation with her. It might come up if they were sort of objecting to what she was saying, or maybe arguing with her a little bit. She would bring up the influence of family. She did break up lots of marriages, almost all of them.
Yeah.
People who came into the group who were married, their marriages were ended because of her, by her suggestion. And that was going back to what I said about the vertical and horizontal relationships. That's why she did that. Yeah. She couldn't have people's loyalty be divided. So yeah, there was, and then as for why I was allowed contact with my family, I don't know. I wonder if she, I wonder if she found some people easier to separate from their families than others. Mm-hmm. The people who moved with her, so we were all in Vancouver, most of us. And as I said, it wasn't residential. We all had our own homes and jobs. But then she did own this fishing resort up in central British Columbia. And there were members of the group who went and lived up there with her. And those people for sure were cut off from their families. So there's a woman named Gail who I reference in the book. who for, I don't know, a year or two didn't speak to her children or her friends. They would call the resort and ask to speak to her, and they would always be told she's not available. She's out somewhere cleaning a cabin or whatever. And they never told her that she received those phone calls.
Oh, wow.
So she wasn't aware that her loved ones were trying to get a hold of her and were still trying to stay connected to her.
Wow.
So when she left, which she thankfully did, she had to go through a process similar to yours of repairing those relationships. And it was only then that she found out that they had never let her go, that they,
Oh my God.
that they had always been trying to contact her, but those messages never got through. So
Wow.
I think given my experience and just what I've learned, I think cult leaders really do adjust their strategies with each individual person. They know how far they can push someone, I think, and they don't push them beyond that borderline. And of course, the borderline gets extended out all the time. But for some people, I guess it goes faster, and for others slower. And she knew how to, it was like she had a little chessboard, and just knew how to move all the pieces and who to
Yes.
move at given times. Yeah.
Right. It's incredible. Well,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting because with my story, I was probably the example of, well, I guess I won't put it that way, but I was definitely one of the people that was sort of made an example of around my attachment to my family. So it was always, of course, my problem, something that I had an issue with, and actually it was my biggest issue. I mean, it was the thing that they worked me over on, for years. And what was interesting is that in our group, there were other people that were in contact with their families. But I think that partly was because those people maybe weren't as close with their families, so it wasn't a threat to their participation in the group. And also, I do believe that the leaders needed examples of that so that they could say, in fact, we're not a cult, and we completely support families. Look at all of the relational work that we do with you guys and all the focus on communication skills. And we help all these married couples, in our group. But the truth was they helped couples until they decided that one of the couple in the relationship might kind of take the other one off a little bit. And actually, this reminds me a little bit of your story. If the guru actually saw you and Michael clearly and the connection that you had, she would need to destroy that.
Yeah.
Because of the loyalty there and the lack of loyalty then toward her.
Yeah.
So I think that really is also why they worked me over with that, is because they saw kind of the strength of that relationship that I had and sort of foresaw that it could be a threat.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Someone who isn't as connected to their family, that connection therefore isn't as big a threat.
Right. And then they have those great examples. Oh no, we don't do that. These people talk to their families, or they see their families, but every once in a while,
Yeah. 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 Oh, wow. It's masterful. I mean, I do talk about it when I explain it to people, like being a chessboard. And when you're on the chessboard, when you're one of the pieces, you can't see what's happening. But the cult leader is, above it and can see the whole board and can see 5 or 6 moves ahead, just like a championship chess player. And in a way, it's just such an evil brilliance, really.
It really is amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, Alexandra, thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure.
Yes. Is there anything else before we end that you feel moved to share?
Well, just that I really do love that you're doing this show for friends and family and people who have someone in a high demand group, because I think that's an underserved population. And there is more awareness of cults these days. I mean, Leah Remini even has her show and now a podcast. And I just noticed I think there's more awareness now of what cults really are than there was 20 years ago. Circling right back to the beginning of our conversation, we talked about me using that word right in the title. And at the time it felt a bit shocking. Now, 20 years later, it feels, well, no, I guess I wrote those 12 years later. It feels less so. I just feel like the general population is getting a little bit more aware of what that means. It doesn't mean people with shaved heads and orange robes all the time.
Right.
But yeah, I love that you're serving this population of people who are really suffering, and education is a big part of, and information is a big part of easing suffering at times. So thank you. And thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yes, you're so welcome. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you.
So when we ended this podcast, I shared this with Alexandra, and I thought to share it with you all. A tiny, more detailed glimpse into my personal experience in my group of high demand, high control. And I figured that every once in a while it might be helpful to share personal insights, as it may just help someone else in some unexpected way. Cult, a Love Story is a really special book for reasons I've already shared but want to mention again. So here's the summary of a moment that happened for me. Alexandra speaks of a lack of self-acceptance as part of the core of what drew her in and kept her there. As I've been exploring this idea that we have a cult self that begins to develop and is kind of the self that we're living in, part of this theory is also that there is always this light or this spark of one's true self, kind of the person that they were prior to entering the cult, and that spark is always there and it always has the potential to come alive. And that was certainly my experience. I've grappled a little bit with this idea around feeling like I wasn't myself, because my experience wasn't really that. I very much felt that kind of dichotomy. And upon leaving, I guess the biggest testament to knowing that there was sort of a cult self that I had was that upon leaving, I really did change. I changed again. And in a way that definitely feels more authentically me. And I think that has to be the case if you are at all being controlled or influenced by people in a way that you don't quite realize, or maybe you have a hint of it. But anytime that happens, of course, there is going to be a sense of freedom and some new emergence when one leaves that kind of a situation, whether it's in, a one-to-one love relationship or a high demand, high control group. So I was contemplating this concept of the cult self, and I was thinking about what Alexandra said in regards to her lack of self-acceptance. And I was thinking what that may have been for me personally. And I came to the quick realization that really for me, I came into my cult with self-criticism. This self-criticism feels different to me than what Alexandra was talking about as lack of self-acceptance. In my experience, they kind of have different meanings, to me at least. And so the self-criticism for me was about a goal of constant refinement and evaluation of myself to make myself feel better. So that was kind of the belief system running under my personal self-criticism. When I entered this organization, I could then rely on the teachers to be critical of me to the point where I really didn't need to be critical of myself because I knew that they would point that out. And they were pointing it out typically around areas where I also was in alignment, feeling that I needed change. So I relaxed into this. And when I left the group, I knew I had the power to change because I had changed and I had witnessed myself and experienced that firsthand, lots of changes. So when I left, I did get very angry about the manipulation over and also the lies. And this is when I was able to see the teachers as false. For those of you who have actually heard my story as a part of the first 2 episodes of this podcast, it was actually my realization that the teachers were lying that was the breaking point for me, giving me the ability to leave, because it was a schism that I couldn't resolve inside of myself. So I really got my power back to be the sole sculptor of my life. And I felt free without someone evaluating me all the time. And I knew that I could and wanted to judge and refine myself in a different way, which ended up being really with kindness. And I really do live that way now. I'm not scared of my internal process and that process of refinement. And it just feels so good to be the one in control of my own changes. I wonder if I would have gotten to this place of compassionate self-inquiry to the degree that I now live if I had not had exposure to the opposite, the criticisms of my imperfection, essentially. This is also why I think now I really love working with the internal family systems modality of therapy, because it truly is compassion-based and it's not trying to be compassionate, but through a process of allowing parts of oneself to reveal themselves, to have a voice in a way that allows for the individual to really understand how that part of themselves is trying to serve the greater good of our system. So for me, the way the critical voice has tried to keep me refining and changing toward good, maybe just not in the most productive way. So remember, dear friends and family, that flame who your loved one is will always be there. And everyone who leaves heals in their own time. But that little flame grows back into a you that you get to now sculpt and refine as you so choose. And freedom of choice is the ultimate state of empowerment. So with that, I hope you have enjoyed this podcast with Alexandra Amor. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Project Hope podcast. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe and comment. You can always get in touch with me at jennifer-french.com. And please let me know any specific topics of interest. And of course, I'm always interested in your stories, whether you've left an organization of high demand, high control, or if you're an individual struggling with the knowing that someone you love is in such a situation. I am here for you. Think critically, take heart, and be free.